All right, Clawson chapter 4 introduces us to these 9 different climate zones or natural regions. Do know that these are not set in stone. There's additional microclimates, or like you saw in the example of Jockish chapter 2, they can be lumped together, or so yeah, there's different ways of explaining this, depending on how much detail we want to go into. But here, Clawson refers to 9 distinct ones for Latin America. And this connects again to that week 1 homework and introduction, where Latin America is not just either rainforest or desert. There's more than 2. And so in this example, there's 9. So different regions, beginning with Caribbean. One thing to note about the Caribbean is that there's the Caribbean islands, which are obvious, but basically all the land that faces the Caribbean also has a lot of Caribbean influence, history and culture and so forth. So the east coast of Mexico, of Central America, the north coast of South America has a lot of Caribbean influence. In Colombia, for example, they'll talk about the Caribbean coast or the Pacific coast. And so it's, there's the Guianas, which we haven't talked much about, but we will. The Andes, the Amazonian, and the Southern Cone. So some regions of South America. All right. For these different climate areas, I'll talk about each one individually, so you don't have to get stressed out to write all this down. And I also, this is one of the PowerPoints I do share that you can access on Canvas. So yeah, there's today, day 5, on Canvas, you can find the PowerPoint for chapter 3 and 4. And so you have access to this. But for the test, you're going to be asked and in the potential test questions, you're asked to distinguish these natural regions, these climate zones, from one another based on temperature, precipitation, based on seasons, and altitude when relevant. And so those are some of the things I'll try to introduce you to here. So first we have the tropical climates, which is the rainforest, where it is wet year-round and they get a lot of rain. There's a tropical savanna, where it is wet in the summer, dry in the winter, and they get less than 100 inches of rain per year. And so the tropical savanna and the temperate savanna have these things in common. The wet summer, dry winter, less than 100 inches of rain per year. But the tropical savanna tends to be warm year-round, and it is a lower altitude, whereas the temperate savanna is less warm and it's at a higher altitude. And so both 2 and 3, tropical savanna and temperate savanna, have wet summers, dry winters, less than 100 inches of rain. Then we get to the dry ones, the arid ones. This is obviously the desert. And a desert is a desert not because of how hot it gets. A desert is a desert because of how little rain it gets. So it's defined by the absence of rain, or how little rain it gets. Steppe or steppe, they're arid. They get more rain than a desert, and they tend to surround deserts. So they're kind of like a transition climate between a desert and whatever's next to it. It'll kind of be in between, a transition climate. These other ones I'll address more individually. So here's a map of where you can find these 9 different climate zones for South America, and then for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Again, a place is tropical if it is within the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So between 0 and 23.5 degrees north or south. The Amazon rainforest is mostly in Brazil, gets more than 100 inches of rain per year, wet year round, seasonal, stable high temperatures. So they don't have much of seasons. They have a greater temperature change between morning and middle of the day than they do, say, between winter and summer. There's continuous and layered tree cover, and the soils are actually very fragile and shallow. We'll talk more about that later when we talk about how there's been this assumption that because there's so much vegetation in the rainforest, that if you just chop everything down, the soil must be very fertile. And they quickly find out that the soil is not super fertile. It actually loses its nutrients quite quickly when it's used for like farming. There's 4 layers of vegetation in the rainforest. The tallest is the towering forest giants, then the tall trees, then the saplings, and then the forest floor. And you're not going to be tested on the specific number of feet at which you can find each one of these. But do know, which ones are lower and higher and how many there are. You were also introduced to biodiversity already, looking at how many different life forms exist in an area. And tropical rainforests are super important for the planet. 2/3 of all life forms are associated with tropical rainforests. And the Amazon rainforest is by far the largest in the world. The greater the biodiversity, the greater the chance of an ecosystem surviving the loss of some of its members. And many of our most important pharmaceutical drugs come from plants. And only a small portion of them have been studied for their possible medicinal use. So there's a lot of potential, and it's super important for the whole planet, what happens to the rainforest, specifically in Brazil, but not Brazil exclusively. Like I mentioned before, the other tropical climate is savanna. Again, to be called tropical, it has to be within the tropics. It's different from rainforests in that it gets less than 100 inches of year instead of more than 100. Has wet summers, dry winters, and it's at a lower altitude than the temperate savanna. And it doesn't have that continuous tree cover of the rainforest. The temperate savanna, temperature depends on the altitude and latitude. Like the tropical savanna, gets less than 100 inches of rain per year, has the seasonal extremes of wet summers, dry winters, and this one tends to be at a higher altitude. The steppe, like I mentioned before, is in the margins of deserts. They do get some rain in the winter, between 30 and 80 inches of rainfall per year. And again, the desert is a desert because of how little rainfall it gets, less than 4 inches per year. They have hot days, which is what we think of, but they actually also get pretty cold at night. The Atacama Desert, you already learned, is the driest place on Earth. It's in Chile. And there's 3 different subtypes of deserts that are created either by that cold offshore Pacific currents that I mentioned earlier, the cold ocean currents that make it dry inland, makes it so there's not a lot of rain. The warm trade winds that are not lifted enough to get the precipitation out of them, or continental temperature controls, although I mentioned already there's not a lot of continentality in Latin America. Here's a new one, humid subtropical, moderate temperatures, rarely freezes. With regard to rain, moderate, it does rain year round and is humid, has a long growing season similar to the southeastern US. And so these areas tend to be known for good agriculture, grazing. Yeah. A Mediterranean climate, specifically in Chile. It rarely freezes there, but it does get hot. They have seasonal extremes. They have hot, dry summers and cool winter rains. This is the opposite of the savannas that I mentioned earlier. And these are referred to as being in the mid-latitude, so not at the poles and not in the tropics. One of the things Mediterranean climates are known for is for growing, being the right climate for grapes that get made into wine. And so places around the world that are known for their wine have Mediterranean climates. Marine West Coast is cool, temperate temperatures. Rarely freezes, rarely over 90 degrees, but it feels colder than it is with wind chill. We're familiar with wind chill here. Very humid, so a lot of rain year round and also mid-latitude. And this you can find in southern Chile. Last one, known both by highland or alpine, where the temperature is determined by the altitude. We already learned the higher the altitude, the colder the temperature. Tends to be in the Tierra Heladas zone with those altitudinal life zones that we learned about. And so in these areas, it tends to be, higher altitude and dry. And the altiplano that we learn about is an example of that. Comments, questions, information to repeat or explain?